We're delighted to have Liz Flock with us today. She is, of course, the host of the podcast Plea that we've been discussing on So Much Crime, So Little Time.
Liz Flock is an Emmy Award-winning journalist and author. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, PBS NewsHour, The Atlantic, and New York Times, to name a few. Her books include The Heart is a Shifting Sea, which won the Nautilus Book Award for books that inspire and make a difference, and her latest book, The Furies, Women, Vengeance, and Justice, just came out earlier this year. Liz, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me.
So we wanted to start off, I suppose, at the origins of Plea. How did you originally find out about Devon's story?
Yeah, so I had covered a story of another woman who had killed an abuser in Alabama, a woman named Brittany Smith, who killed her rapist. And I had written a long piece for the New Yorker magazine about her. And when I was writing that piece, I was really curious how many stories there are out there of women who kill their abusers and in Alabama, and just how big this problem was, because one of the things I found out reporting this is that there's no one actually tracking this issue of how many women are sitting in jails or prisons who claimed self-defense after defending themselves against someone who abused them. And when I was looking into that, I did a call out to lawyers in the state of Alabama, and Devon Gray's lawyer responded, and he said, "Hey, I have another case for you of a woman who claimed stand your ground after killing her abuser, and she lost." And actually, at that point, I'm trying to think, I don't think she had her stand your ground hearing yet, but he was pretty confident that it was going to be an uphill battle. And so I started following Devon's case, and the thing that struck me from the beginning was how little coverage she had gotten. Like, there were just two little news stories that said, "A woman kills man in domestic dispute," with no details. And that was very different from Brittany's story, which had gotten, even before I covered it for the New Yorker, a lot more attention. And so I was immediately curious about what was going on here.
And from the bonus episode we heard where you were interviewed by Gloria Riviera, we heard how you're still in touch with Devon. Can you give us an update on how she's doing?
Yeah, Devon is still living at home in Baltimore after being released from prison after 5 years. And she is with her daughter and living with her dad and stepmom and working. But, it's really tough road when you get out of prison. I think the journey towards healing only starts then. It's not like our prisons are actually rehabilitative in any sense, and especially for women who've gone through abuse. So I think every day is a struggle for her. Right now she's saving up money and to get a car. I think she actually has saved up enough money to get a car, and then after that, an apartment. So step by step, but she's working really hard and spending a lot of time with her daughter.
I really appreciate
That's
that you
amazing.
included that in Blind Plea, that it's not just about getting out of prison, but once you get out, it is really hard to rebuild your life. I thought that was, I really appreciated that being included in the podcast.
Yeah.
I want to ask on a little bit of a different track. So one of the things that stood out to me was your research for this story. It sounded like it was really exhaustive. So, like, one of the things you mentioned was, I think you said you read 14,000 text messages. And then there's also like all the recordings, the interrogations, the court transcripts. How do you kind of make sense of that, like, incredible volume of information? Like, how do you sort of step back from that and organize your thoughts with so much stuff to sort through?
Yeah, and I think our team did almost 1,000 interviews for this as well, or I might be wrong about, but definitely thousands of hours of interviews. And it's a team effort in the sense that there was a lot of people working on this, and we were all putting our heads together to figure that out. But I know anytime I work on a project, I become like a hoarder where I just collect everything I can and then try to make sense of it. And oftentimes it's really helpful to build a timeline, because you look at how one thing leads to the next, especially in life, but in crime as well. And I think the text messages were really helpful because you saw how their relationship developed over time and how things escalated, and how much Devon was struggling and how it got to that point. And we did that with, all of the court files as well. You see Devin tell the same story over and over again, but her get questioned at different points. You see how the lawyer starts to feel that she's not going to win her case. You see everything develop. And so timeline is one big thing. Massive amounts of organization of your files is another thing. There were so many people working on just organizing these files. I feel like so much of making a podcast is, especially an investigative podcast, is completely unglamorous because you're just really trying to organize everything you're doing so that you can put the pieces together. But, some of it is really interesting. Going through the interviews, listening again and hearing, wow, there's this detail that I missed that this person said. And, being in Alabama and tracking down different people who could help us figure things out and going to their house and, showing up there because they weren't answering the phone, like the guy who happened to be there with John the night this all happened, for example. Those parts are, being in the field is always my favorite part because I really like meeting people and talking to them and hearing from them. But the file organization, not so much.
You can never shut down your computer.
Exactly.
What something you mentioned I wanted to touch on there. So you've done a lot of different types of reporting, different types of journalism, different media, right? Like, so this was a podcast. So compared to like long form, like written work you've done, how was the decision made that this was a story for a podcast versus another form of media?
So I had said on Devin's story for a while, I thought about writing another magazine piece about it or even making a documentary. And I felt like if I wrote a magazine piece, it was going to be the same kind of format as Brittany's. And I felt like I don't want to tell these same stories again and again if they're not making change. Like, people read Brittany's story and people have been talking about women who kill their abusers for decades, and we're kind of in the same place we were in the 70s. And so I'm constantly just seeking new ways to tell stories that might reach people in different ways. And I also just I had opportunities to tell Devin's story through documentary, but I was worried about that with trauma and people who've been through so much. TV can be really difficult and just re-traumatizing. And when the podcast opportunity came around, because Lemonada Media reached out to me and said, hey, do you have another story of a woman who killed her abuser? And I was like, do I have another story? I have like thousands of stories. But Devin's story immediately came to my mind because it had been not covered at all. And I knew she wanted to tell her story. And I think the thing that I'm really grateful for is podcasts. You can go in any direction. It is like so innovative and creative. And, we thought about telling one episode as a fairy tale. Another episode was, about investigating the parole system. And then another episode was just like unpacking John as a person, and just the ability to not just tell a straightforward story of a woman who killed her abuser, but go in so many different directions. I felt I was able to get other people into the podcast that might not otherwise be interested in it and to start to care about this issue. So I'm not just reaching New Yorker readers sitting in their New York apartment being like, oh man, not to denigrate that, but just like I want to reach a wider audience of people who might not already know about this.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that really worked with the structure of this podcast. Like there was times where I felt like it was structured sort of like you might lay out a book in terms of having these different sections. But in the end, I think this format really served telling the story well. And yeah, I thought that was really successful.
One other aspect I felt that was so there's a lot of aspects about Blind Plea that I absolutely adored. But one thing that made it stand out for me was the relationship between yourself and Devin. It added such a depth and such raw emotion to the entire series. And I was kind of interested to know, when you began researching this podcast and laying out how it would be structured, was your aim to build that strong relationship to add that layer to the podcast, or was that something that just developed naturally?
To be honest, I build that kind of relationship most times I work on stories now, because I only work on really long-term stories. So there's one woman I've been talking to in prison for 5 or 6 years now who I still haven't done a story on. And I think so much of my early career was spent doing really quick hit churn out journalism, and I've gone so far in the other direction. And especially with women in prison who have complex PTSD, I don't want to parachute in and out. And I also just connected with Devin. I mean, she's a mom just as I was pregnant. And um, I felt like she, she's also an aspiring writer. So we had some commonalities, but also I just felt like she was so honest and straightforward and direct, and that a lot of times when you're talking with someone with complex PTSD, like Brittany in the other story I had covered, they don't always people don't always tell the truth, and for lots of complicated reasons. And I felt like Devin was this like amazing person who, despite everything she'd been through, was still able to like directly convey what had happened and honestly, and that impressed me a lot. And I just, as a journalist, I felt like, wow, this is a person whose story I really need to tell. And yeah, I connected with her as a person and admired her for that.
Yeah, I can imagine. I know it was mentioned numerous times actually around the trial how Devon was honest to a fault.
Yeah.
And sometimes and throughout her trial, which is ridiculous, but I can understand how that led to such a deep connection between the two of you. But I really felt like that had added such depth to the podcast. I have listened to a lot of podcasts and I feel it. My emotions get involved, my heart breaks for certain stories. But towards the last 3-4 episodes, I just kept crying. There were so many different, just a different sentence would just hit. One in particular was, you were on the phone to Devon. She was due to get out in April and you said, can I buy a plane ticket? And it was just this really simple interaction between yourself and Devon, and it hit. And it was clear to me from the very start that you had a really good relationship with Devon, but it was at those points, those really simple interactions, that it really hit home how much you cared, and how strong that bond was between the two of you.
Yeah, and the sad thing is, I did buy the plane ticket, and Devin didn't get out, and I still haven't met Devin because I haven't, I because I've had a baby, and we will meet one of these
Yeah.
days soon. But it's just kind of wild because I probably know more about her life than most people, and we've spent more time on the phone, and we still haven't met in person. So
There's also another moment in Blind Plea that I wanted to ask you about. It's the moment where Devon is supposed to get out of prison, but it's held up until they can contact John's mom, Christine, to let her know, as family of the victim, that Devon's being released. And we hear this, again, a very raw, very honest interaction where you're considering calling Christine, and then you do call her to find out if they have in fact been trying to reach her, but you're stuck in between.
yeah.
You're unsure how to deal with it, and I'd love to. It felt really tense in that moment for us. I can only imagine what it felt like for you, but I'd love if you could talk to us a little about that moment.
Yeah, so I had actually never encountered something like that as a journalist, and ethically, it felt really difficult to know what to do. It sort of was ridiculous to me in the first part that Devon's release was hinging on whether Christine answered the phone. You know, obviously it makes sense for when someone's getting out of jail or prison to potentially have a victim notification program where you notify the family of a victim that that person is getting out, but that's really intended for someone who kills someone else in like cold-blooded murder and then is getting out. It's not really intended for situations like these, but it applies. And so I understand that, but the state of Alabama didn't actually notify Christine until it seemed the week of. They didn't take, and Devon's whole family is planning for her to get out of prison. People are taking time off work. They're driving all the way from Baltimore to Alabama. So much is riding on her getting out. People are emotionally preparing her daughter, everyone. And then you're just waiting for someone to answer the phone. I mean, this is 2024. You can send someone an email. You can send you could send someone regular mail. You could call multiple times. There's so many options. The state of Alabama just, it seemed from everything I reported and found out that they just called her like a day or two before or that week, and then she didn't answer the phone, and that was it. And it turned out that Christine's phone wasn't even working. And then to not let Devin out as a result, I mean, so I didn't know whether I could talk to Christine. Obviously didn't want to violate Christine's trust, and I also didn't want to prevent Devin from getting out of prison if I told Christine something. And it just was, a lot of times in journalism, I feel like you're walking this tightrope of respecting all of your subjects and respecting your readers or listeners as well, and respecting the truth. And we had a lot of conversations editorially about how to handle that.
Yeah, it was definitely, the way it was put across was definitely a really tense moment. But I think it was important to show it. It showed nearly there's so many issues that have been brought up in blind plea with the justice system, specifically in Alabama, but in the United States in general. Um, but something as fundamental as that, you don't call once a couple of days before. There are other
Right, of
options.
course.
So I do think it was important to tell.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why we wanted to talk about blind plea on our show, one of the things that made me interested in it was because it was about an interracial relationship. So this is kind of close to my heart. My wife is Black, and we often talk about this topic. Like, we're aware of how like we're perceived differently in different parts of the country. Like, we've lived in different parts of the country, and we're also aware of how like Alabama was the last state to overturn the ban on interracial marriage, which you bring up in blind plea. And also you talk about how Devin may have been less sympathetic to a jury there because it was an interracial relationship. I'm curious, like, how much of a factor do you think race played in the decision to try to do the blind plea in Devin's case?
Yeah, I mean, there's no way of knowing exactly, because so much of bias and perception is like, I'm sure you might feel the same way, but it's like almost covert instead of overt and hidden. But what we were able to pin down was that her lawyer made that calculation, that it made a big difference, and that her lawyer made the calculation that if she had gone to trial, a jury would have been a majority white jury, probably on the wealthier side, probably with some biases, maybe, with some, outright racism towards interracial couples. And that calculation was made by her lawyer, and he encouraged Devin to take a blind plea as a result. I think race and gender both played a role, and it's hard to know how much each of those played. People's ideas about domestic violence are super antiquated, in addition to people's ideas about interracial relationships. And it's hard to disaggregate those two, but I think I noticed how much race played a role, not only in the reporting, but also in the reactions to this podcast. So Apple actually had us on the homepage for a long time as Blind Plea is like the #1 podcast to listen to. And they put it with the headline, like, Black woman kills white abuser. And so many people were almost like triggered by that headline and were like, we're not racist. Like, how dare you race bait us? And like, it just showed in the comments that people, because I could tell anyone who was commenting as Apple put this up was commenting without actually listening, but just responding to the headline. And I was like, God, we are so sensitive as a country, and it's so fraught. It's so hard for people to even talk about or even consider. And so I don't know. I think that was a conversation we had of how much can we pin this down. And, like I said, there's no way to know exactly how much, but it certainly played a large role.
I'm glad you included gender in that too, because I also think in my experience, like, there's couples are perceived differently depending on, which half of the couple is which race, right? Like that matters too in people's perceptions and people's biases. One other thing on this topic that I want to ask you about. So Devin, part of her youth was spent in upstate New York, Saratoga Springs. That's where I grew up as well. I lived for 8 years there. And like, that area is, in my experience, overwhelmingly white. And there are, I think, biases there, but I think it's different than what you'd get in Alabama. And I'm curious if this is something that you ever talked about with Devin, about like how I could see, and this is again my sort of conjecture, but I could see someone who lived in that area having maybe a different perspective on what it's like to live in a very overwhelmingly white area than what you would get when you move to Alabama. Um, is that
Yeah.
something that ever came up?
Yeah, I mean, I think Devin has felt like she was always in white spaces. She grew up in, a suburban girl in largely white environments. And she said it never really bothered her because she felt accepted. But I think when she got to Alabama, it felt different because there were like outright comments and because people made, yeah, just said specific things. And I think for Devin, at least, it sounded like there was a big difference between being in a majority white space where she felt accepted versus being in a majority white space where she felt
Yeah.
othered. Um,
Okay.
so,
Um, just a couple more questions. One thing I wanted to ask about was, so episode 5 is called The Other Woman, and this one's about Alexis. We haven't talked about Alexis yet here. There's a note at the beginning.
oh
Yeah.
God,
There's a
Alexis.
note at the beginning of that one about
Mm.
how your team talked about like kind of how difficult that the decision was to like what to do with that part of the story. I'm curious now, kind of looking back on it, how do you feel about the way that you covered that, or how do you feel like in terms of how that fit into the broader story?
Um, I think Alexis was a person who I didn't want to spend so much time on, and a lot of us felt that way, but it was such an important piece of the story. Even when we're talking about race, thinking about why the detective uh, might have accepted Alexis's story as a white, attractive woman giggling and sitting across from him versus Devin, a poor black woman who was not flirting with him. And I think it, to me, was such an important piece to show how who is believed and why. And of course, we don't know, but I just think laying that out there for the listener to hear. Um, it also is such a huge trope in cases like these where in the courtroom they will say that a woman was either angry or jealous, and so to say that Devin was jealous and this is why she killed John with absolutely no evidence, like even in those 14,000 text messages, even when she complained about Alexis, it was like, hey, it's fine if you have another woman, but can you just come and spend some time with your daughter? It like actually disproved their theory of jealousy in a lot of instances. And so I think it was really important to handle that as delicately as we could. I really wished I could have talked to Alexis. Alexis actually did reach out to us after the podcast. And I asked her if she wanted to do an interview for a follow up episode, but she didn't respond after that. So I tried really hard to reach her, though, because I always want to include everyone's voice as much as is possible.
Yeah, and as you said, obviously, Alexis and her story was huge in the entire trial, and in terms of what the police went with, the detectives went with in terms of the case overall. So it was definitely very important to hear that.
Yeah. Yeah. I said, oh God, Alexis at the beginning only because so many people have had such strong reactions to her. Listeners have. I've gotten so much mail about Alexis asking where they can like find Alexis, which is not the point.
Oh gosh.
So
No, not the
I don't
point.
know. It elicits, she elicits a lot of reactions.
That seems like an odd reaction.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would like to pivot to something slightly different. One of the surprises late in Blind Plea is the beloved Janice, who picks up Devon when she gets out of prison and plans this whole special day with her. Cried again at this part numerous times with the balloons, with her saying, let's go get a mani-pedi, let's buy your daughter a present. Out of nowhere, Janice just comes in out of nowhere, and it was really nice to see because I feel like we got a lot of not so positive people or that arrived into the story from Alabama, and Janice is this ray of light, and it was beautiful. Was this as remarkable as it seemed?
Yeah, it was. She arrived last minute for us too. We went down in April to be there for Devon's release, and Devon was not released, and Janice was the owner of the bed and breakfast where we were
Mm-hmm.
staying. And she was really, she's kind of the embodiment of one of the best things about the South, which is Southern hospitality. And she immediately was very interested in Devin's story. And we had just said, hey, this is the story we're covering when she gets out of prison. We're going to meet her. And she said, oh, bring her here. We'll make a big lunch for her. And she immediately wanted to be involved in helping out. And then when Devin didn't get out, I think she was devastated, just as like a new person to the story, and then really wanted to keep helping out. And I think that's one of the coolest things about following stories in real time is things happen along the way that you don't expect. And she was just like kind of this magical surprise of a person. And I think was just, little guardian angel sent for Devin's release. So.
Yeah, I love that. We often discuss as we're reviewing podcasts, some of the characters, the people that we hear about that we say, I want to sit down, I want to have a cup of tea with, or I would love to sit down and have a pint with or a drink with. And Janice for me, obviously yourself and Devin as well, but Janice for me just came out of nowhere. And I was like, I need to meet her. I need to just sit down and chat to her.
Janice deserves her own podcast because Janice has so many stories. I have had many cups of tea with Janice, and I can tell you that the amount of stories I wanted to include where it's like, this has nothing to do with Blind Plea, but
maybe there's a spinoff coming. All right.
I love that. Yeah.
Janice, the spinoff.
That actually gets to my last question, which is, so Blind Plea came out last year. The Furies came out, about 6-ish months ago. And I know these are both like multi-year projects. That is a huge amount of work. Do you already have additional projects in the pipeline? Like is there something next that's coming that you can talk about?
Yeah, putting out The Furies, which actually is like really subject-wise related to Blind Plea. So those who have listened to Blind Plea might be interested in The Furies because it's also about women who fight back, but in different places around the world. And one of the stories is based in Alabama, and Devin's story is actually mentioned in The Furies. And so even though it was two giant projects, they were feeding into each other for sure. But I'm always working on a lot of projects at once. So I'm working on a documentary about two women who fought back against the Dakota Access Pipeline, and they actually designated domestic terrorists for sabotaging it to try to stop the flow of oil. I wrote a magazine piece about it for The Economist, and now we're making it into a documentary. And I'm working on my next book as well. And that's in its early stages, and a couple magazine pieces. So
it's a lot.
I'm always really busy.
Do you ever take time off?
All of my time off is with my baby. So
well, that's fair. That's fair.
I got in a 15-minute run before I talked to you guys. So I'm sweaty on this conversation. So
I do one final. I know it's a lot having a 10-month-old and you seem to have a lot of projects on the go as well. I do wonder, are there any podcasts that you listen to or books that you read that are not on such heavy subject matter? Is there anything that provides a little bit of lighter relief for you, or is that just not your vibe?
I think I always go to books. Fiction is my escape, and I've been reading so much good fiction this year. I'm trying to think what I would recommend. I actually read a romance novel for the first time ever in my life. I will get the name for you. It's like you make a mockery. My mom brain can't remember right now. But sometimes you have to, I'm actually like, would be ashamed to say I read a romance novel, but sometimes, okay, it's an intellectual romance novel. Okay. It's called You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty, by Akwegi Amezi. And it's a Nigerian novelist who has actually already won a ton of awards. She's written books across like 5 different genres. And this book is full of like all of the gossip and like just, I don't know, lush ridiculousness. And sometimes you just need something so different than what you do day to day. So
absolutely. Definitely have to put that on the book club list.
Well, Liz, we can wrap up. We want to definitely thank you for taking this time to talk with us. I think I don't know if we set out right, but we certainly alluded to Blind Plea was I think, one of the most amazing podcasts that we've listened to and that we've covered on our show. So we were super excited to have you here to talk learn a little bit more about your process and about this story. So yeah, thank you so much for taking this time.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I actually have the Furies on hold in the bookshop that I'm going to get at lunch. So I'm excited about jumping into that.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're looking forward to following the next projects that you put out as well.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much for your time, Liz. We hope you enjoyed this special interview with Blind Plea host Liz Vlock.
On our next episode, we're going to talk about a guy who cleans up crime scenes, a boy who solves mysteries, and a man who returns to the scene of his many crimes seeking redemption.
More specifically, we're talking about a single episode of This American Life from WBEZ Chicago.
Did you know that the podcast Serial is a spinoff of This American Life? So is S-Town.
Sometimes This American Life tackles true crime, and that's what we'll discuss.
We're focusing specifically on episode 653, which is an updated version of episode 164. It's called Crime Scene, and that's probably the best way to search for it. It's available on thisamericanlife.org.
That's next time on So Much Crime,
So Little Time. So Much Crime, So Little Time is a production of Mind Glove Media. The executive producer is Paxton Caloriso. Our associate producer is Blythe Ty. Our theme music was composed by Vyacheslav Starostin. If you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to this show on your podcast app. And don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and a review. Even better, tell your friends. To join the discussion, look for us on social media. Check out the show notes for all the links. Thanks for listening.